So next up, we're going to talk about some BLM land management issues. BLM land use planning, and we're going to talk about, there's a new proposed way that they're going to make land management decisions and planning for that, and that's Planning 2.0. And briefly, I want to tell you about our speakers that we have, and that will be, let me get right here. We have Nada Wolf Culver. She's the director and senior counsel of the BLM Action Center with the Wilderness Society. And as that, she's the director of the BLM Action Center and provides technical advice and support to citizens and conservation groups working to protect their public lands. She has extensive experience navigating public land issues, so we'll be hearing from her, would be great. We also have Rebecca Watson, and Rebecca is a former Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals at the U.S. Department of Interior, which is the Bureau of Land Management. So she was number 2 in that pecking order for a number of years during the George W. Bush administration. Yes, exactly. And she's a shareholder in the law firm of Wellborn, Sullivan, Meck, and Tooley, with offices. They have offices in Colorado and Wyoming. And Ms. Watson has more than 30 years of legal and policy experience in the fields of conventional and renewable energy, mining, natural resources, and federal and environmental law. Our other speaker is Leah Baker from the Bureau of Land Management. And a few words about Leah. She is the division chief for the division, Leah Baker is the division chief for decision support, planning, and NEPA at the Bureau of Land Management, and she comes to us from their Washington office. So with that, I'm going to turn the panel over to our speakers, and they are going to navigate this together. And if you want to, however you want to come up here one at a time, or however you want to do it. Yep, and here's, oh, I hear that.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for having us here today to speak about the BLM's planning process and how it pertains to the energy sector. I appreciate Mr. Ray's introduction. I am one of those card-carrying bureaucrats that can't be wrenched from her job. So thank you for inviting me anyway. I come from the Washington office, as Kirby stated, and our group is responsible for developing the land use planning policy that pertains to the 245 million acres of surface land and many more subsurface mineral estate that we manage in the West. Our group, in addition to developing that land use planning policy, also reviews individual plans. So last year in Colorado, as many of you are no doubt aware, we approved a bunch of resource management plans, including major oil and gas amendments, like in the White River Field Office down the road. So we are heavily involved in the high-level policy, and then also getting down into the weeds of individual land use plans. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about how we're proposing to change our planning process through an initiative we've called Planning 2.0, and I understand that many of you in the room have been participating in the public meetings that we've had around this as of late. So some of the material may be some you've already seen, and some of it's a little bit new to address this crowd. So thank you very much. I'll get started. Going the wrong way. So we've been asked, why are we updating our process? Mr. Ray mentioned the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. It was established in 1976. It's 40 years old this year, and it is our agency's organic act as we evolve from the Grazing Service and the General Land Office into what is today the Bureau of Land Management. And that's the law that tells us that we have to do land use planning. The rules around that, because there's regulations, were written in 1983, shortly after the establishment of FLPMA, and we've learned a lot since the establishment of those rules about land use planning through the development of 160 RMPs throughout the West and in the East, where most of our jurisdiction is over mineral estate. And we've learned 3 key things, and that's the real driver for why we're updating our planning rule here now. The first thing is that collaboration is a key fundamental component of good land use planning. The second is that, of course, like the resources that we manage, plans really shouldn't stop at the traditional jurisdictional boundaries that we've established for them, which heretofore has generally been at the field office level. We have about 160 field offices. We do have some cases where district offices are establishing plans, and I also have a couple of examples shortly that talk about some novel planning concepts that we go beyond that traditional BLM field office boundary. So our plans need to extend beyond those traditional boundaries because the resources extend beyond them. And then the last key driver for why we're updating our rules now is stuff changes. And if we aren't able to quickly evolve to the changing environment, be it related to socioeconomic conditions, ecological conditions, environmental conditions, or other social conditions, then we're behind the eight ball. So we need a process that allows us to be more responsive to the change that's inevitable and that's occurring all the time. So we've talked a little bit about the Federal Land Policy Management Act that has one of those great TLAs. That's a 4-letter acronym, FLPMA, or 5. That establishes the groundwork for our planning policy. And then highlighted in red on your screen is the Code of Federal Regulations, which is what we're in the process of revising right now and in an open comment period, which I'll talk about shortly. And then the last spot where we establish our primary planning policy in the BLM is through our Land Use Planning Handbook, which we will also be revising once our rules finalized. So we're in the middle of our rulemaking comment period. We just announced last week that we will be extending the comment period based on input probably by some of you, an additional 30 days. So the comment period will be open till May 25th, and there are some slides at the end of the presentation that I won't go into, but that will be shared with you that provide some tips and quick access to where the rule is in the federal rulemaking portal. So if you would like to provide comments, you can get into it quickly there. We started the Planning 2.0 project back in 2014. We had listening sessions in 2014 in a couple different states. We've tried to use technology as much as possible to get out to people to talk about the rule and the proposed changes in the handbook too, because we can't get to every field office. And opportunities like this to speak with groups like you are also very helpful in a way to talk about what we're doing and begin a dialogue about some of the more complicated or contentious or potentially detrimental parts of any changes that we would propose. So our rulemaking effort has been published for comment for about 2 months now, and we've had a lot of discussions with a lot of different constituents interested in BLM and the planning that we do. And 2 kind of key messages or themes of questions have arisen that we are grappling with trying to answer. One is, what do you mean by landscapes, the landscape scale planning, and the landscape approach? And then 2, the second one, is around how the proposed rule would change the ability of state and local governments to participate in the planning process and the decision-making process. So what I'll talk about in the next few minutes is contextualizing what this proposed change is behind these 2 questions, or using these 2 questions to talk about the changes. There's a lot more information out there that we're trying to provide about the whys and whats of our proposed rulemaking effort. Again, at the end of the slide presentation, there's some information on how you can find more information, but with about 15 minutes each, we can't get into the detail of every specific piece of the rule. So that first question, what are landscapes? What's landscape scale planning? And what's the landscape approach? So this is a definition of landscapes from the Department of the Interior. And the key that we'd like to pull out for landscapes is that they're about ecosystems and human systems. They're not defined by size, but they're defined by common as much as we can, common management concerns. And that's the definition we're using as we move forward in the Planning 2.0 paradigm. They can be big and they can be really small. So these are two planning efforts, one underway and one completed last year that representing BLM land use plans. So we've got the West Eugene Wetlands project, which is less than 2,000 acres. It's in Oregon. It's an urban area butting up against the town of Eugene, and the issues were surrounding watershed, threatened endangered species, and recreational access, because a lot of people in the town of Eugene use this area. So that was a land use plan that we completed that was pretty tiny. And then a contemporary plan that is the polar opposite of that is in the desert, the California desert. So we're currently hopefully completing in the next couple of months the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Project, which plans for 22 million acres of lands and is a hallmark effort to try to coordinate planning with the state government in California, the federal lands, and other non-BLM federal lands. So landscape scale planning. So we talked about what landscapes are, saw a couple examples of what landscape scale planning looks like. So the key kind of themes that we pull out of what landscape scale planning is to us is that it's informed by management concerns, and to the extent possible where those concerns are consistently agreed upon by the various stakeholders in the process. It's a hard line to draw because every resource that we manage has a different landscape or a different influence. But when you put them all together, we try to find a common sensical boundary around those to conduct planning. It considers multiple landscapes, as I mentioned, and multi-scale management, which I'll talk about a little bit in the next slide, and it encourages cross-boundary coordination. It aims for edge matching where possible, which is a challenge we've seen in land use plans to date. I'm sure some of you are familiar with some of our energy corridors, and we have in some states, I used to work in BLM Arizona, we would have energy corridors to allow for transmission lines that wouldn't match up at the state boundary with California. They were like this, which doesn't exactly make for good implementation of those corridors. So one of the goals is to seek edge matching where possible. So multi-scale management is about planning at different levels and taking into consideration plans, policies, and decisions from multiple entities, multiple jurisdictional authorities, and looking at it at all the different layers of planning and decision making that we do. So on the right over here we have non-BLM plans. So those could be county plans, state resource plans, local municipal plans if applicable to where the public lands are. And then we've got the BLM planning hierarchy over here on the left. So multi-scale management is really about considering all of those other plans, the non-BLM plans and policies in our resource management planning process, at our activity level planning process, which would include oil and gas lease EAs, and then also at the site-specific level, maybe individual APDs or smaller lease EAs, or also master leasing plans, which we're proud to have several of in the state of Colorado. And then the last L word for today is the landscape approach. So the scientific literature, BLM research, DOI research has shown that there are some key tenets to having a successful approach to planning when you're dealing with the complexity that we all face in terms of decision making with federal, state, local, tribal needs. And so we've adopted kind of this 7-tenet approach to what is a successful landscape approach. It's about engaging all the stakeholders interested and with jurisdictional authority in planning. It's about making a solid assessment of what the ecological, economic, environmental, social issues are in a given planning area, to be able to identify in a truly meaningful and authentic way what the trade-offs are amongst all of those potentially competing issues, managing at appropriate scales, Where possible, integrating management, and managing ultimately for resilience of that entire landscape. That's economic resilience, social resilience, environmental and ecological resilience. It's about using high quality information, which includes the best available science. And then finally, the landscape approach allows us to adapt to change, which I had also mentioned is one of the key drivers for why we're proposing these changes to our planning rule. So in the proposed planning rule, that's about, the meat of the rule is about 30 pages. There's about 200 pages of preamble. We try to address all 7 of these principles of a landscape approach. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those specifics next. So that second question is about how do state and local governments engage in the planning process? What are the opportunities afforded, and how does this new process change that? So FLPMA guarantees a lot of things, but related to state and local participation, it guarantees 3 things. Public participation in general, which includes all stakeholders, including state and local governments. It also guarantees coordination specifically to governmental entities. That coordination requirement does not apply to the John Q. Public or special interest groups, but to state, local, tribal governments and other federal governments as well. And finally, it provides for the requirement that we strive to be as consistent as possible with state and local approved land use plans. So as part of our proposed rulemaking effort, we're providing, we hope to provide, once it's final, new opportunities for public involvement. So up on the screen is, in black is our, a simplified version of our current planning process. And the points at which the public, stakeholders, governments get to engage in that process is at the scoping, and at the draft stage before it becomes final. And of course, there's the opportunity to protest, but that's at the end of the process. So under the proposed rule, we've got 2 new places that we would like to seek engagement, and that's through a plan assessment that would be completed prior to initiating scoping. And the idea behind that assessment, going back to that 7 principles of a landscape approach slide, is that it provides a comprehensive assessment of what the resources are in that planning area and what initial issues we may be seeing with resource conflict, so that we can go into the scoping process, which is required by the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, with everybody having more information to inform scoping. Typically, that assessment is done after scoping and isn't usually a public document. And best practices from our 35 years of planning under our current rule have shown when we do this earlier, it's more beneficial for all parties involved. People are more informed. We can make better decisions and create better alternatives to inform better decisions. The second spot that we're proposing some new changes and requirements are in this preliminary alternatives phase. So before we develop a draft resource management plan, we will share our preliminary alternatives for input. We're not proposing a formal comment period on those alternatives, but have left the rule pretty flexible so that individual planning efforts can decide the best way to engage with their interested stakeholders in that alternatives review. So those are 2 spots where we're hoping to increase opportunities for public participation. That includes, of course, our state and local government coordination, and with our coordination requirements under FLPMA, we have, again, that imperative to ensure that we're trying to be as consistent as possible. Okay, on to coordination. That planning assessment phase, is it time? Okay, all right, I'm gonna wrap it up. I've already mentioned, gosh, the time goes by so much faster when you're standing up here.
You guys are managing the time, so just you're.
Yes, right.
It's time? All right. 2 minutes. We think, in a nutshell, we think that the plan assessment and the alternatives outreach will help us improve our coordination requirements that are guaranteed by FLPMA. And I'm going to skip this one because it's covered in this slide. We've proposed changes, and this is what we've heard from a lot of folks as a concern in initial comments or questions on the rule, is that we've taken out some of our consistency requirements guaranteed by FLPMA. And what we've actually done is tried to clarify, because in the existing rule, coordination and consistency were kind of conflated, and they were a little bit confusing, certainly internally, and I would imagine, since it's a rulemaking, a federal rulemaking, externally as well. So we've tried to separate coordination and consistency into two distinct sections in the rule, and we talk about how coordination's goal is collaborating at all levels of planning with state and local governments and input on inventories, issues, and the policies that inform those. And the outcome of coordination is that it applies to the whole process. So it's a procedural process requirement. Consistency, on the other hand, and how we've characterized it in the rule, its goal is to seek consistency of the actual land use plan decision. So we've clarified in the rule that we will aim to, of course with the caveat that it is legal with federal law, be consistent with state and local plans. So the more that we think that by coordinating more upfront through those extra steps, that we have a better opportunity to seek that consistency, knowing what the land use plans are at the local level, knowing what some of the issues are, more touch points to engage in the process. And ultimately, when it comes to consistency, the rule and FLPMA require that we seek consistency where possible in edge matching decisions. So I'm done. I'm just going to say these last couple slides here that you will get in the presentation materials for today will point you to some of our resources that we've got online, where you can learn a lot more about specific components of rulemaking. I appreciate you listening for 15 plus minutes to a federal employee talk about rulemaking, which is super thrilling, I know. It really is exciting for us, because we think that we're taking all of these amazing lessons learned, input from all swaths of public interest users, and institutionalizing them and making for a better process. So I appreciate it. And if you'd like to comment on the rule, we encourage it. The deadline will be May 25th. So there's just over a month left. Thank you.
Good morning. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why you should care. I've met a lot of planners last night at the wonderful ranch party, and thanks to the Jollies for opening your home to us. It's a beautiful place. I think all of you planners know why planning matters, and this is BLM's process to plan the use of public lands. I saw this quote in the Casper Star Tribune. Wyoming is getting a new state director of the BLM, and I thought this is a good summary of why we should care about how BLM's lands are planned. And they make the point that the BLM manages over 30% of Wyoming, over 2/3 of Wyoming's minerals. It decides where that kind of development can take place. It decides where recreation can take place on public lands, and where land should be set aside for wilderness or for wildlife. So very important in these public land states. And this map illustrates federal land ownership throughout the U.S. And you'll notice that the west of the Mississippi is where BLM has most of its management. And of course, this illustrates all federal agencies: Park Service, Fish and Wildlife, BLM, and the Forest Service. And you can see the percentage of federal land in these states. So it just is common sense that what they decide to do on their land has a huge impact on state and local economies. This is Colorado. Colorado is 36% federal management The yellow is about 8.3 million acres out of the 24 million acres in the state. 8.3 are BLM managed, 14.4 are Forest Service, and then there's about 1 million acres managed by an assorted other groups of federal managers. And BLM manages all the minerals, all the oil and gas and coal, no matter what's on the surface. Any federal minerals are managed by BLM. So just to hit on what Leah said about why we're having land use planning changes, well, times have changed. And Colorado, I think, is at the cutting edge of that change in the West. It's a very growing state. I read that I think by 2040 or 2050, the population will double. We're at about 4 million now. We're going to have 8 million people living in this state. It's urbanizing, particularly along the Front Range corridor. People talk about a corridor going from basically Cheyenne, Wyoming, all the way down to Pueblo. And it's diversifying. By 2040, the state of Colorado will be 1/3 Hispanic, for example. And Denver is the #1 destination for millennial-aged people in the country. So a lot of new people coming in, younger people. So it's kind of an exciting time. There's also been new technologies since FLIPMA, and certainly since the rulemaking in the 80s, GIS, GPS, aerial photography, all of those new tools. There's new science, new understanding of fire on landscape, wildlife migration corridors, well, just a greater understanding of wildlife than we had before. And I think everybody on this stage will agree land use planning takes too long. When it takes upwards of 10 years to plan, do a plan in California, which is one of the fastest growing places, you can see that by the time the plan gets done, it's already out of date. So there's a need for change. I just want to hit on a couple things that I think make sense. I like the idea of enhanced public participation. I think BLM opening the door earlier, getting people involved, educating people. I think that's a good thing to do. Implementation flexibility. We didn't talk about that at all, but one of the things that's built in is that the means to achieving the goal of the plan will not necessarily have to go through land use planning. So as new information comes along, you can make changes without going through a big formal process. Certain things will remain part of the amendment process, most importantly, oil and gas lease stipulations. That will have to go through a planning process, but a lot of other things won't. And then I think the idea of getting external data, getting data from state and local agencies, from outside groups, from universities, and putting that into the federal process will be very helpful. Having worked on the inside, the government doesn't have all the information, and even if they have all the information, they may not know that they have it, or where it is, or how to access it. It's a lot more cumbersome than people appreciate. Leah talked about the special role for state and local governments, and this slide contains the guts of the planning provision in the statute, the Federal Land Policy Management Act, or FLIPMA. So you can see in a number of places and repeated the important role of state and local government. And I think that that is something to keep in mind. And it's a special role. It's not the same role as the public or NGO groups or the American Petroleum Institute or COGA. It is a unique role that I think reflects the map that we saw. The fact that the federal government manages the majority of these states, and the state and local governments who are impacted by those decisions should have a heightened role to have a say in where their state economy and landscape and values is represented in the federal process. So it's an important role. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the landscape perspective. This is, as Leah pointed out, this is a concern that people are raising. And, you know, we heard at the extra webinar they had last week, which was great. It addressed a lot of the problems that they were hearing about. is that these landscapes can be of different sizes. It can be big or small. And they're based on common management concerns. We heard that this morning. And that they can be nesting. So you can have watershed, wildlife habitat, a fire escape, maybe oil and gas development, all inside of one. So it's moving away from that field office focus that we're all used to something that's a lot more amorphous. And always the devil's in the detail. But what I read in the preamble is they're talking about the fact that these plans will be bigger, and that will save BLM money. So that's one counterpoint to the fact that they may be small. It seems like part of the goal is to save money, and they might be large. And then who is deciding the boundary of this landscape? That decision will be made by the BLM Washington office director. So it won't be made locally, it will be made in Washington. And the political fact of life is that the voices of national interests are louder in Washington than the voices of local concerns. So that is an issue. And then scale matters for analysis. When you talk about the concern of rifle as to how oil and gas leasing might happen, that can be a very big concern. It could mean, your neighbors losing their jobs, different things happening, and a big impact to your community. But on a state level, national level, international level, it might not matter so much. And that is one of the changes that I see in there. Right now, the rule says you have to assess the local dependence on public land resources. The proposed change is to look at that in the context of local, regional, national, or even international. So I'll just quote from the Northwest Forest Plan that we may remember from the 90s in Oregon for the spotted owl. It said that, it says that the jobs cost to the plan's curtailed timber harvest were relatively small to the affected state's overall economy, but the impact of a few lost jobs to small timber-dependent communities can be a lot of jobs. So scale matters. So how they draw that boundary matters in how things get analyzed. So some of the examples that we see that the BLM has cited as an example of their new planning, again, are very large. The sage grouse resource management plans that BLM just went through, that's 67 million acres. And for context, remember the state of Colorado is 24 million acres. So these plans covered 67 million acres, 68 BLM field offices, 24 service units in 10 states. Now, this new planning effort is predicated on collaboration and coordination and consistency. Well, what happened in the sage grouse plan? Idaho, for example, worked very closely with the BLM, and they developed a plan. It was approved by the BLM state office in Colorado. There was buy-in, there was a support. Similar, Garfield County. Garfield County spent a lot of money to develop a sage grouse management plan, worked closely here in the state, had a lot of coordination meetings, but then the final decision was made, and it was made by the BLM Washington office director, who felt it was more important that there be consistency across all the resource management planning areas. So much for coordination when higher priority came along. Another example is one that Leah also cited, the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan. And this is a plan that covers 22.5 million acres in Southern California. And the purpose of the plan was more or less to design areas for renewable energy, taking into account other values, because they have, I think there were something like 27 listed species, plant and animal, they had to take into account. 10 million of those acres were BLM acres. So the balance was state and local land, and counties were intimately involved in this process. This process took 6 years to get to the draft. The ROD, as Leah said, is going to come out this year. That's +2, so eight-year process. And what happened at the end of it? Well, when the final environmental impact statement came out, the county said, heck no, this is not what we thought. And so they pulled out. So BLM now is going forward with its federal land use plan without the counties, and the counties are taking more time. I thought San Bernardino made a comment, and their comment was they hold over half the acreage in the plan, and the proposed plan was going to take 85% of their prime developable land, so what land they have to develop in their county, and devote it either to renewable energy or to conservation. And talk about taking the control of the county away from the county individuals. So they rightly, and along with 6 other counties, called a halt to it. So that process is ongoing. And I thought it was also interesting when you look at this, okay, this plan was designed to promote renewable energy. So what happened? So we have 10 million acres of federal land. 9 million are to be used for conservation or recreation. Less than 500,000 for renewable energy. So the other disappointed folks were the wind energy in particular, and then also solar energy, who saw reductions in the land that they got from the solar energy plan that had been completed earlier. Public participation. As I said, I'm a fan of public participation. I think it's great. One of the things I'm most proud about that I did as Assistant Secretary was get the cooperating agency rule done. We were the first agency in the whole government to fulfill the directive of NEPA to have cooperating agencies. And we made that a rule in the BLM, and then Secretary Norton directed other agencies in the department to do likewise on certain levels of plans. So I'm a believer in public participation. What concerns me is, can the process be gamed? And yes, of course it can be gamed. Conservation groups, environmental groups are a valuable part of our public dialogue, and they have important perspectives that add to good decision making. But the reality is they have a lot more capability than county governments do to participate in these process, to file through action alerts tens and thousands and hundreds of thousands of comments, to show up at hearings. It's a common complaint that industry never shows up at these hearings, or local people or just regular people that are living their lives don't come, but environmental groups, conservation groups are motivated, so they're there. So there's an opportunity to have a slanted perspective on what happens. And so that is a concern. And again, it's what I said before, there's always a push and pull on public land between local interests and national interests. And there's an opportunity there for national interests to outweigh local interests. And NADA might talk about it, but one of their perspectives is that public lands should be zoned for different uses, and that's a useful concept. That's what they did in the solar. And a concern here is, will these national voices zone out a county's backbone economy? So that is a current concern. Mineral master leasing plans are something that NADA's organization, among other environmental groups, are advocating be made a part of this rule. They're not in the rule right now. Right now, they are a guidance document that Secretary Salazar issued in 2010. My concern here is that MLP concept, which is a mini plan for oil and gas, and it drills down in a certain area and examines oil and gas and makes decisions in advance of leasing development and says these areas must be protected, others must not, or don't have to be, they can be drilled. And there were 4 criteria. Each of the 4 criteria needed to be met. It wasn't leased, it was mainly federal, there was an expressed interest in oil and gas, and there was a need to address some other resource impacts. But there was an exception. At the discretion of the BLM field office, state office, or national office, you could do an MLP, even if none of those criteria were there. Well, this is what's happening now. There is a directive from Washington encouraging MLPs, and as I said, there's an advocacy effort around getting MLPs in part of it. The way I look at it is that the MLPs were a way to come back in and rewrite the Bush era land use plans that they didn't like, and it results in less land being available for oil and gas. That's kind of the point of it. And it adds another layer. I just list up here the layer of NEPA that we have currently. If you're going to develop oil and gas, there's a lot of NEPA. MLPs are another layer of NEPA. They can be done as part of the land use planning process, so can eliminate that. All right. Whoops. Somehow I missed something here. I'm trying to talk so fast that I'm losing myself here. So anyway, my last point is I want to talk about kind of big picture reasons why I think there are some concerns with some of these changes. And I want to talk about culture, capacity, and politics. So capacity. Anybody who's following politics knows that the budget is squeezed. Discretionary spending, which is what BLM's budget is made out of, is very small. When you take out mandatory spending for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the defense, there's very little left for discretionary agencies. And the Department of Interior is pretty low on the totem pole versus State Department, other departments. Its budget isn't that big. And BLM is even lower on the totem pole. They manage more federal land than any other agency, but their budget is the lowest. And reality is that is not going to change anytime soon. So they're building in more comments, more public participation, but where is the budget money to handle that? Their own economic analysis for the rule says it's going to cost more, but they hope that they'll save money by shortening up some of the other processes at the end. I think that is wishful thinking. I think that these issues are contentious. More public participation will expose more comments and disagreements. It will take longer, and analyzing comments is expensive. That has to be contracted out, especially, it's just a lot of volume of comments. So that's a concern. The BLM culture, and people that haven't worked inside the government, they might think, culture? What are we talking about here? We're not talking about silverware and China. Every bureau has a culture. The Forest Service has a way they look at themselves. Fish and Wildlife, BLM. There's an agency culture that's a reflection of the mission and statute and then just years of being there. BLM's culture is not outgoing. It's not looking to collaborate. It's not one that is interested in being mandatory. That's not what I'm saying. But it's an agency that comes out of the progressive era where experts were put in place to run our government, run our lands. They know best. They have the science. They have the education. And so it's not natural for BLM to reach out and work with communities. We had a big effort when Gail Norton was there, the collaborative conservation, working more with local communities. And it was very difficult. Some BLM offices, they love to do it. They have the vision that Leah is talking about. But other bureau offices, no way. They didn't go into the BLM to talk to people. They don't want to do that, and they don't want to devolve their power. It's their field office. They're going to run it. So it's like anything, different people in different offices, but there's a culture there. And just two examples from around here, the one I gave earlier about Garfield County and the sage grouse effort, trying to work with BLM, trying to set up coordination meetings, but in the end, the BLM culture was, let's have one size fits all, which is the government's fail-safe choice to have one size fits all. It's simpler, and it's easier to implement. It's easier for people to deal with in the government. Rio Blanco County, this wasn't a planning effort, but this was a BLM decision where they were deciding to put endangered, or in this case, threatened plants in the county as an experiment and to see if they could transplant them. Well, the county had some concerns because they were already dealing with the native plants that were there, and it caused them a lot of expense. They had to go through a particular process to prove up impacts and spend money with outside consultants to deal with that. Well, the BLM approached them and said, let's enter into an MOU. Well, they didn't hear anything more about it till they got 15 days to comment, and these endangered cacti were going in right next to some of their main roads. And that case now is on appeal at the 10th Circuit. Okay, so politics. I mentioned this before. Who decides these questions? The Congressional Research Service, which is part of Congress, it works for Congress, makes this point in a 2014 report. Ownership and use of federal lands have stirred controversy for decades. Conflicting public values concerning federal lands raise many questions and issues. Who decides the national-local balance and how these decisions are made? So the reality is that the public land management decisions are made politically. And you can't get away from that. Different people have different values, different parties have different values. And who gets in changes how the land is managed. And that is just the nature of the beast. So my parting three comments are, he who wins makes the rules. Elections matter. Federal management is changing. Secretary Jewell gave a very important speech this week, basically saying that we need to think big when it comes about conservation. We need to save more landscapes. Isolated places aren't enough. And I think that state and local governments cannot practice business the way they have in the past. When this rule is put in place, you have to have the capability, the capacity to participate. If you don't, somebody else is going to be deciding your future. So I think that's something that each county needs to think about, is how to staff up to participate in land use planning. So, thank you.
I don't have control of this. Thank you. Thanks. As Kirby mentioned, I'm Nada Culver with the Wilderness Society. I direct the BLM Action Center, and our focus, which undoubtedly after the context Rebecca just gave you will sound extremely sinister, is to help the public participate in land use planning processes. So yes, we are all about that. And obviously, we do have a conservation focus. We're the Wilderness Society. We focus on public lands around the West in the BLM Action Center and trying to achieve a balance between energy development and conservation. So for instance, we were very supportive of the solar programmatic effort that Rebecca mentioned, trying to find the right places for solar on public land and supporting those projects as they move forward. And you know, we do seek conservation. We also seek to provide a public perspective in this conversation. And I will just say as a disclaimer, we are generally supportive of this effort. I don't think that just because we're generally supportive means you shouldn't like Planning 2.0 altogether. So I just thought I'd give some perspective on a few of the issues that we were hearing about already. So the first one is the planning assessment. This is a new step, and the idea is to start with a clear message that there will be a more proactive process, planning ahead and getting to a better result. And to us, getting information in earlier, getting your suggestions in, this is a great way to get ideas in. And this is open to the public, but you know, of course, it's open to everyone, all parts of the stakeholders. And to us, having the BLM commit to look at a wider range of values and uses and using this process to get input right from the start of where people think recreation is important, where people think energy development is appropriate, and of course, you know, where it might not be. It's also a chance to have a conversation. So we're not just putting things in the suggestion box here. The way the rule is set up right now, there would be an actual discussion to share viewpoints. So not just a ballot box, not just a suggestion box, an actual discussion. I don't know who this army of facilitators will be that will make us have these conversations in a civil manner, but I'm very excited to see how that works, I have to say. And, we think that's a great idea and an opportunity to have the discussion earlier. A lot of folks in the public, just like any other stakeholder group, are often blindsided. And what do you mean there's a 30-day scoping period for a 4 million acre plan? We didn't even know anybody was starting that plan. What do we say? By the time you figure out what you want to say, your 30 days is gone. And all of this will be subject to BLM evaluation. So yes, we may see some people put some kooky ideas on the table. That's the beauty of the public. But again, there will be a process for making sure there's high quality data, and there will be an evaluation before that moves forward. And interestingly, one of the entities at the table for deciding how that information will be used are cooperating agencies. The rest of us will be outside the suggestion box, and you all will be in the suggestion discussion. We did mention, Rebecca did mention the culture issue. The Forest Service has been using this type of process for some time now, and they have felt that it is getting them to a better place with their plans, less conflict as they move forward. So public participation, these are federal owned lands, but they're public lands. They belong to all Americans, and that gets you a lot of people with a lot of interest, whether you would like them or not. So one thing to keep in mind, this to me is a good thing. The National Environmental Policy Act, which governs all of these processes, talks about public scrutiny being essential and valuable. It's the whole purpose of making these processes have all these formal steps. And it's, crucial to a good output. And for, our perspective, we find that when people are engaged and they feel they're heard, even if what they hear is thank you for coming, that's a really wacky idea that we'll never do, that still goes far, and that's an important part of the process. There are 2 new formal opportunities, the planning assessment, which I just mentioned, and at that point, people like my organization that go out and do inventories for wilderness quality lands, we will be able to put those in front of the agency at the beginning instead of coming in later and arguing about it. Other citizen proposals for management and local economic priorities. So, in this area, we've seen a lot of conflict around citizen viewpoints. The Rome Plateau case that ended up going back to the BLM for planning, that case was won and lost on the fact that in large part citizen proposals were ignored. And similarly, there was a lot of conflict in the Uncompahgre field office when the citizens of Paonia wanted to be heard. And, initially they were not heard, and finally they made so much noise they were heard. And I would just point out that the idea here is if you get those proposals in, if you welcome those proposals in the beginning and have them discussed, it's really a lot harder to bring a lawsuit later on and complain about it because you've been heard, you've been evaluated, your input has been taken. So it's got a lot of value for the entire process. The other new step that Leah mentioned is preliminary alternatives. And again, this can be very informal. The BLM has actually been doing this for years all around the West. My favorite one of this was the BLM in Idaho around the Snake River Birds of Prey did a coffee shop tour. If you wanted to hear what they were doing, since they'd gotten all your suggestions in the box and you were wondering what they've been doing for the last 2 years, you could come to a coffee shop, meet with the BLM, I don't know, play acoustic guitar, wear a beret, who knew? But it was just an idea to get more input, again, so the BLM could get feedback before they publish those documents. We've all seen that are this tall, and you just know that when the BLM has created a document this big, and you come in and say, oh, I have a really great idea you haven't thought of, it's a much harder conversation, or if you think they've gone completely wrong. So we think, again, the preliminary alternatives have a really good opportunity there. But again, the BLM will still make the decisions on what goes into the actual alternatives, working with cooperating agencies. The other big change that I think we have some concerns about is most of the comment periods are shortened. There are 2 new steps, so arguably we'd have a lot of time to say things. But again, as I mentioned, sometimes it's hard when you only have 30 days. And right now, the BLM, as compared to other federal agencies, gives the public and other stakeholders a lot more time to provide their comments. This rule would radically shorten that. And, you know, all the people have a lot to say and a lot of pieces to add to the public. So, and a lot of challenges to address. So we're a little concerned about that one. We have more steps, we have less time, you know, we all have a lot to say. And I just wanted to put this up. I know that the public participation has gotten some concerns, and as Rebecca noted, but this is a study that was done by the National Academy of Sciences, and they found that when done well, public participation tends to improve both the quality and the legitimacy of a decision. And this goes back to what I mentioned before. When people feel like they've been heard, it goes a long way. And you get to better results, less conflict down the road, and then you get trust and understanding going forward. One of the ideas of Planning 2.0 is we can be more flexible going forward. We're going to need trust for that. If the implementation decisions can get changed in a flexible manner, we're going to need everyone to buy into those plans so they don't try to challenge them. I wanted to just mention a couple of things on the cooperating agencies issue, since I know I've heard a number of you already in this room speak about this concern in different contexts. And having looked at it, one of the interesting things was back in 2005, these regulations were revised. And they were revised to explicitly refer to the role of cooperating agencies at every step of the way. So you can thank Rebecca for that. It made it very clear. This rule does not take that away. It does not change that. And the BLM is very clear in this process that it is not the intent to change that role. And in fact, there are a few additional steps now where the cooperating agencies are involved that they weren't before, such as in deciding what to do with all that information that comes in the planning assessment. That was not there before. So you'll still, you know, get a lot of opportunities to be heard, and you have a special role. And again, the cooperating agencies, for people who aren't one, they're designated for their special expertise. And the local county commissioners are a great example of that. They know things the BLM can't know. Some of our BLM folks have been living in these communities for a really long time, and some just got here. So that's an important role, and it gives you special access. The great unwashed masses of public, no matter how many wild alerts my members submit, we're never getting across that velvet rope to where you are sitting at the table. This is somewhat of a source of frustration often for the public. They believe there are sinister things happening back there, but from the purposes of looking at it from my perspective, there is special expertise there. There is a special role. That's why you have special access. We don't get to sit at the table and help write alternatives. We don't get to sit at the table and decide what information should get in the mix. We don't get to see anything like that until they go out for public comment. And then one thing I wanted to mention is the public has been observing these meetings. In Montana, due to their sunshine laws, the cooperating agency meetings are open to the public. The Wyoming Resource Advisory Council up there has advised the BLM they would like to see certain cooperating agencies made open to the public. And we've seen some of that happen on, I think, some of the Thompson Divide meetings here. And from what I've learned from asking around from folks, it seems like that's been okay. You know, again, the public doesn't get to come on the other side. You guys are still in your VIP special tickets area, but they get to observe and see what's happening, and that's helped with some trust there as well. And I did just want to mention this term, cooperating agency, this comes from the National Environmental Policy Act regulations. That's where it comes from. It's not FLIPMA. And because these environmental processes are governed by NEPA, that's why the BLM is using this. The consistency language that Rebecca put up comes from FLIPMA, and that requires to be, you know, an effort to be consistent with state and local plans. But the reason we're talking cooperating agencies here is not some difference in intent. It's a different statute. It's annoying legal stuff. I did want to mention, just since Rebecca put it up there, about the maximum extent of consistency. It also says to the extent practical. So I understand why you don't want to mention that, because it is complicated. So the BLM does have to try to reach consistency, but it's to the extent practical and consistent. So keeping that in mind when you're engaging, and we're trying to keep that in mind when we comment. Landscape level planning, you heard a lot about this, so I'll try to be quick here. Again, it can extend across the boundaries that aren't recognized by everyone, but it can also adjust to different issues and resources to be larger or smaller, as Leah mentioned. Interestingly, in this rule, the scope of these plans, they would ultimately be decided if they're going to go across state lines by the director, but the governor has a seat at the table. The governor is explicitly included in deciding what the planning area will be for a plan. So again, as cooperators, as people who are working closely with all the state agencies that are here, again, there's a very important opportunity to shape that discussion. That's not the subject of things that we get to comment on, but there is a way for the state to be involved. And I think that's important because when we're talking about planning for different resources at different scales, the governors will have a lot to say about that. And finally, I was asked to talk about master leasing plans, I think just for my friends from Montezuma County who I know appreciate this topic. I've talked with a lot of you about this before, I think. The reason we've highlighted it, and just to be clear, we're not asking to put it in the regulation. This regulation, it's 20 pages in the rule of really big letters. I don't think that any specific designations need to be talked about in the rule. Our discussion of this was to highlight it as something that was an opportunity to highlight as an example of Planning 2.0, as an example of landscape level planning that would be at a smaller landscape, because most of the time when we talk about landscape level planning and the BLM does, we're talking about things like those grouse plans or the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, which my favorite thing about that is that's the desert tortoise landscape, and I love to think about desert tortoise just booking all over those 22 million acres, and they really need a landscape. But I'm having a hard time envisioning the tortoise using all their acreage. But the master leasing plans are something that comes down to a more manageable level, and thinking about the key aspects of Planning 2.0 of planning at multiple scales and defining boundaries, looking at a dynamic and durable process, and being efficient. You know, we see master leasing plans as something that can do that. There are these criteria as well as the flexibility to decide where they would go. And, you know, they allow us to define the right boundary for effective decision making. And it's intense. Generally, these have been based on conflict and industry interest. So you have to have some industry interest, otherwise why would there be a conflict? And also potential natural and cultural resource impacts. Other industries like recreation have become a big discussion, air quality, water quality, other mineral potential. One of the ones we're doing in Utah is trying to kind of mediate between potash and oil and gas. These are not just something the conservation community came up with. These were in the oil and gas reforms that were issued in 2010. The BLM proposed a number of their own master leasing plans that have been completed in Colorado and Wyoming thus far, and they're continuing to go forward. And they're tailored to address these conflicts and be dynamic. And I've been working in Wyoming with Fremont County, and they're looking at how to implement their master leasing plan to, yes, it does include some new protections for things like big game, but also looking at how they can make the leasing that is permitted there more efficient, because the idea is if you do this more intensive analysis, you should be able to lease and develop more efficiently there once it's done. It's put us in a really interesting position to be the Wilderness Society saying, let's go lease and develop here. This is a challenging tool for everyone. We've supported it, again, as a way to get into a more intensive discussion where we know there will be conflict, because we can tailor these protection measures, be they just best management practices, new stipulations, conditions of approval, and it's been really interesting to me to have, you know, a lot of, I would not call myself a normal person because I talk about BLM and oil and gas stipulations, but to be having these conversations with normal people and having them say, I want to propose a stipulation to protect water. So the ones we've used are only a quarter-mile setback, to be clear, just since that's been discussed. But, you know, it's really been an interesting thing to see people who are in these communities who are not saying, no more, don't do any drilling. They're saying, we know there's drilling, this is part of our economy, how do we manage it so we can honor everybody and everyone can be at the table and have a say? And I understand that might be an uncomfortable place if you haven't had to have those conversations before, to have some lady who works at the Walmart tell you she'd like to see an NSO with less waivers. I'm sure that's a very bizarre experience. It is for me, but I think it's a really interesting conversation and an interesting opportunity. And they can be efficient. They can be in an RMP or they can be a standalone. They can be done very efficiently. And, this is kind of the way, to me, we've been experiencing oil and gas on public lands for quite some time. It's just a fight. And if we can have this conversation, to me, this would embody some of the principles of Planning 2.0. If we're developing master leasing plans like the one in the Dinosaur Trail one that's out of the Meeker Field office, where do we have triggers, phase leasing? We don't have any lands closed. Not a single acre was closed in that plan because it was not in the scope. That master leasing plan talks about how to develop around Dinosaur National Monument, how to address wilderness quality lands, how to address big game. And it's got some triggers in it. It's flexible, and we'll be able to see it work, I hope, soon. Last takeaways from us, from my perspective, it's more thoughtful from the beginning, this process. Everyone gets their input. We would like the agency to be better informed. When we come in and we've inventoried millions of acres for wilderness qualities, and they say, really, are you sure? And we say, you know what, we could all go outside and check that out. And look, it's there. That's really can be a frustrating conversation to have 3 years or 4 years or 5 years into a planning process. To be invited to the table and have your voice heard in the beginning, it's extremely helpful. And then we also think the BLM will make better decisions with more stakeholder input. And again, I think from our perspective, we'd like to see more about this idea of flexibility to design for different contexts, because I think landscape does seem to come out in this sweeping horizon, and less so in these more intensive discussions. And we are cautiously optimistic, cautiously because this is a bureaucratic process, but we're thinking that it can, really shape a productive conversation. So we're going to look forward to commenting and continuing to support the public participation.